Hey everybody, it's Ed. Before we start, two quick announcements. First, I want to thank a brand new Patreon supporter, Scott Talbot. Scott signed up to support the podcast on a monthly basis through Patreon, and I am actually getting ready to be working on the end of the month Patreon video and newsletter that goes out to all the generous folks who have chosen to support the podcast that way. There are lots of different ways you can choose to support it. You can go to mountainprairie.com/support to learn more. Second thing is I want to thank my good friends at Ranchlands for their generous support of this episode. If you've been listening to this podcast for a while or reading any of my various writing, then you probably are already familiar with Ranchlands. But if you're not, on its surface, Ranchlands is a ranch management company that manages a number of spectacular ranches throughout the West, in Colorado, Wyoming, New Mexico, and Texas. But managing large landscape ranches is just the tip of the iceberg. Through their work in conservation, education, adventure, and land stewardship, there's a ton of overlap between Ranchlands' work and many of the ideas explored here on Mountain and Prairie. At its core, Ranchlands is a collection of thoughtful individuals who care deeply about the West and who are working hard to leave the Western landscapes a little bit better than they found them. I know all the folks over at Ranchlands, and I consider them to be friends and partners. I write for their excellent blog, which is called the Ranchlands Review, and I'm actually hosting my 5-day retreat, the Strenuous Life Retreat, at the Zapata Ranch this September. Again, Ranchlands and Mountain and Prairie are aligned in many, many ways. So if you're a fan of this podcast, I expect you'll be a fan of Ranchlands as well. If you want to learn more, head over to ranchlands.com. On that website, you'll find a variety of different ways that you can get involved with the organization. You can read articles that are written by or that are about some of my past podcast guests, including singer Riddy Arman and artist Duke Beardsley. You can buy some of their handmade leather goods at their online store called the Ranchlands Mercantile, or you can arrange a stay at the Zapata Ranch, where they're currently offering low early season rates and discounted local rates. So again, go to ranchlands.com to learn more. Thanks a lot to Ranchlands for their support. Hey, this is Ed Roberson, and this is the Mountain and Prairie podcast, where I introduce you to some of the innovative individuals who are shaping the future of the American West. I meet most of these people through my work in land conservation or through my hobbies and interests that revolve around spending time up high in the mountains. My guests include ranchers, writers, entrepreneurs, conservationists, athletes, artists, adventurers, pretty much anyone who's doing important work, has an interesting story, and loves the American West. My guest today is Kate Mannix. Kate is a rancher who works alongside her family on the Mannix Ranch in Montana's Blackfoot Valley. The Mannix family has been ranching and stewarding their family ranch since 1882, back when Timothy Benjamin Mannix purchased the land from the Northern Pacific Railroad. For generations, the Mannix family has served as loyal caretakers of this spectacular landscape. And over the years, they've evolved their business and land management approaches so as to continuously improve the ranch's soil, water, flora, and fauna. Kate was born and raised in California, but moved to Montana for graduate school, where she fell in love with both ranching and the Rocky Mountains. A few years later, she was accepted as an apprentice into the Quivira Coalition's new Agrarian program, a unique program that connects aspiring farmers and ranchers with experienced regenerative agriculture practitioners throughout the West. After a stint in New Mexico, she eventually found her way to the Mannix Ranch in Montana, where she fell in love with Bryan Mannix, who's now her husband. So today, Kate is officially a Mannix, and she's also an invaluable part of this storied ranching operation. Kate and I connected virtually and chatted about everything from the business of ranching to her favorite books, with lots of fascinating topics in between. We started out talking about the history of the Mannix Ranch and how her family has managed to maintain such a successful family business for so many generations. We talk about challenges facing a ranch and the business of ranching, and the importance of land conservation and regenerative practices for the business's sustainability. We talk about her time at Quivira, her stint as a vegan, her current love of hunting, and her family's thoughts on her career path. She also shares some inspiring and instructive thoughts on her recent battle with cancer and some of the lessons she learned from the scary, life-changing experience. We really talk about a lot in this episode, so please be sure to check out the episode notes for a full list of everything we discussed. I've been wanting to have Kate on the podcast for quite some time now, so I greatly appreciate her making the time to chat. This was an educational and inspiring episode, so I hope you enjoy. I want to know every single thing there is to know about the Mannix Ranch, starting in 1882. I want every detail. Go.
All right. All right, 1882. Well, I can give you a long history of T.B. Mannix's wartime occupations before he came to the Blackfoot Valley, but I'll spare you. Yeah, so the ranch, we're on our fifth generation sort of working on the ranch, but there's some sixth generation kiddos running around. And that's fifth generation on both sides of the family, which is pretty cool. So on the Mannix side of the family, T.B. Mannix came over in 1882. And then on Grandma Darlene's side of the family, the Gearys, who still ranch neighboring us, came over actually in 1867. So they're some of the earliest sort of white settlers in the Blackfoot area.
Yep.
Yeah. And so the ranch was passed down to both Grandma Darlene, who's generation 3, and then Grandpa Bert. So they would be third generation. And then it's currently owned by the 3 Mannix brothers. So that's Brent, Randy, and David, and their 3 wives. And then there's, they have 2 sisters, and both of those sisters are local as well. Renee is on the ranch, and she's our resident massage therapist, which
man, that's awesome.
Can claim. Yeah. Yeah, it's like our ranch office and our massage therapy office right next door.
Nice.
And she actually lives in the original homestead on the ranch, which is right next door to that burnt down, but partial fire a couple years ago. And she kind of saved the house and exposed a lot of the log, walls and stuff. So anyways, that original homestead is still here, which is cool. And then Sister Annette lives in Lincoln, just a couple 20 minutes from here, is a school teacher. So everyone stayed pretty close.
Well, I want to talk about how you ended up there, and we'll get to that in a second. But just overall, like, how would you describe the ranching operation? I mean, is it like what type of livestock do you have? What type of grazing practices do you do? I mean, if you had to just describe it, kind of give an overview of the actual operation for people who aren't ranching experts, how would you describe it?
So the ranch started with sheep, as most Western ranches did, but starting in the 1850s, turned into a cattle operation. And so we just have cattle. We do have some sheep that come over in the summer as a trade and do some weed grazing for us, but we don't own those. We have a cow-calf enterprise. We birth out calves here and starting in about a month and run those through the year. We also have a stalker enterprise. So we keep either all of our calves or we buy some calves and keep them. And then we do like an intensive grazing program all summer long with those yearlings. We have a grass finished beef enterprise. So we direct market and finish a couple hundred head each year. So we keep that over, and we have a van route that we do. We drive meat all over the state of Montana. We, do the farmers market over the summer, and then we work with restaurants, primarily Helena and Missoula, on sourcing their burger and beef products. And then we have a timber enterprise. And so we have some logging enthusiasts in the crew. And so they spend all winter thinning out a lot of the forested land. And a lot of that is sort of in partnership with NRCS money, as far as fuel reductions and stand improvement and all that. So those are sort of our standing enterprises right now. There's always talk of, diversifying. We've been talking a little bit about pigs and chickens and all that. We do have a lot of bears in this area. So whenever you're thinking about new enterprises, you have to ask yourself how bear friendly they are.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when I think about your area, I used to spend some time there a long time ago, but there was that recent tragedy. I guess it was last summer where somebody was camping in the town park there and a bear just came out and got him. I mean, that's serious grizzly country. As far as the grass fed I'm always curious how ranching operations decide to go into that side of the business. Cause I mean, you can obviously feel really good about selling that kind of meat. And I think there's a demand for that kind of meat, but just from what I know, the little bit I know as an outsider, it seems that is a more difficult business to be in. So when did your family decide to go in on the grass finished side of things? And like, how has that been versus if you were just to send them to feedlots, like the vast majority of ranchers do?
Yeah. Yeah. And we do, I mean, we're unable to direct market all of our products at this, all of the cattle we raise. So we are mixed, some of them go to Nebraska, but in the early 2000s, the brothers became a part of Ranching for Profit. They were sort of some of the early ranchers to jump on that boat. And Ranching for Profit, I don't know if everyone's familiar with it, but it's a really great organization that kind of puts ranchers through a week-long school where you learn how to run your operation like a business and, analyze your operation like a business. And that seems like something so simple, like, oh, why wouldn't you ranch for profit? But, ranching is really it's a legacy and it's a lifestyle for a lot of people. And so looking at your ranch as a, business that needs to generate profit can be pretty new. It can be a new concept to a lot of ranches, honestly. So they went through that program. And one thing that program has you do is it, has you pull out your enterprises. It has you look at what are your overheads, what are your direct costs, and then ask yourself, should I even be doing this? And so one of the things that came out of that was this acknowledgement that overheads are high for this ranch. And that's a mixture of, we have to have a lot of equipment because we have to hay because we're a high mountain ranch. We can't winter graze. They've tried that. It doesn't really work here. And so we have to have a lot of overheads that way. We have a lot of different ranches that have been conglomerated all into this ranch. And so we have different kind of homesteads on the ranch. So there's a lot of overheads with that. And then the biggest one is that a huge value for this operation is to support as many families as possible and support the community, sort of growth and development, like have kids in the schools, have people here. And so being able to support as many families as possible is a pretty big objective here. And so that's an overhead. That's the huge overhead, employee wages. So sort of out of that was, Ranching for Profit would say, have as many cows per person as you possibly can. And the Mannixes are a little bit more like support as many families as we possibly can. Mm-hmm. And so short story long, out of all of that came this need of like, okay, well, we can't reduce our overheads, but maybe we can add value to our product. And so the decision to do grass fed was really out of that, like, let's add value to our product. And a grass finished, range raised beef is a higher value product. And so from that, everything has shifted. We changed our genetics to be better finishing on grass. We have a more moderate sized cow, so they're more efficient now. We've tried different varieties of Angus to sort of, always better be able to finish on grass. So it's really led the whole operation is this grass fed business. And it's really because of this value of supporting people.
One question I had when I was in grad school, I took some class on family businesses, and the main takeaway that I took from that class was that it's very, very rare for a family business to last beyond 3 generations. I mean, I think it was something like 99% of family businesses are, done after 3 generations. And you think about just business in general, and the ranching business is such a tough business to be in. Even in the best of circumstances, this is a tough business. And then, and so why would you say the Mannixes have been so successful over generation after generation? Like what has your family been doing differently that maybe other ranching families or other businesses in general don't do? Because the business is one thing, but then I would think managing the relationships is a whole different thing. So, I mean, if you had to boil it down, what has been the Mannix's secret to success for going on 140 years?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing is that we really have a leg up in that our forefathers didn't reproduce as much as others have, and so even though it's a, fourth and fifth generation ranch, up until the fourth generation, there were really sole heirs. And so, like Darlene inherited everything from her side of the family. Bert inherited everything from his side of the family. And then the three brothers inherited the ranch. And and have worked together with really great relationships. And I'll touch on that too, because I think that's huge. But we are sort of, for the first time now, facing that question of like, how do you divide up ownership? And what is ownership? Is it ownership to feel like you are a part of the family legacy? Is it, control on the ranch? Is it control over the land? There's a lot of different definitions of what ownership can be. And I think what's really cool about the folks in this generation is that everyone wants to see the ranch succeed first. People are not trying to grab their piece of the pie. It's like everyone is like, whatever we need to do to keep this legacy. And it's almost that everyone wants an ownership of the legacy more than like, I want, my profits each year. And that's huge. And it's really lucky that we're set up this way, because it's where we are in the Blackfoot Valley is an amazing sort of set of legacy ranches. I mean, we're so lucky in that most of our neighbors have been here since the 1800s. And you don't always see that in Montana anymore, because there's such a patchwork of ownerships as family ranches, kind of die out. And so, but looking around, and each of our neighbors has a different challenge in that succession. And we're really in the midst of that. Our fourth generation is looking at retirement here in the next 5 years. And so we're really looking at, okay, so now we're really facing this challenge with, potentially 9 owners. And so figuring out how to keep the control, the power with the folks that are on the ranch, but making sure that everyone feels like they're part of that legacy.
Yeah. There's probably the most successful business person that I've ever had the pleasure of knowing. And he's a really good guy on top of that. He's not one of these cutthroat types, but I was asking him about this. How has he been so successful over and over? And he said his whole deal is whenever he has partners, he makes sure that everybody's interests are perfectly aligned towards a common goal. And it sounds like, and if everybody's eyes are on the same prize, a lot of the personality things kind of never come up or take care of themselves. And so it sounds like that's exactly what y'all are doing. Your interest, everybody in the family's interest is aligned towards keeping this ranch going. But so, obviously internally things are good with your family, and everybody's, moving in the same direction. But when you think about challenges in the future, or challenges right now, or things you see coming down, 5-10 years out, what are the biggest challenges that the ranch is going to face? Because like when you and I talked on the phone a while back, we were talking about, a lot of the out of state, or people coming in and buying legacy ranches as a vacation spot, or, there's drought issues, a million different things. But like, what is of concern to your family when you think about external things that you can't really control?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think, land ownership is one. I mean, the Blackfoot it's a treasure in that there are, it's a 1.5 million acre watershed, and there's only like 9,000 residents. And a lot of those residents are really invested in the valley, whether they're legacy family ranches, or honestly, we have some great out-of-state landowners that have kind of come in and bought in and become a part of the community and do a lot for conservation in this area. So we're so lucky in that regard, but like, you can't discount the fact that we're an hour from Missoula, that we are we're on the way from Yellowstone to Glacier. It's like, you're right in the middle of this, and somehow we've escaped it this far. But so thinking about like conservation strategies, looking at the places in the valley that are vulnerable to different ownerships, looking at development. We have this amazing rule in our county planning commission where in this part of the county, you can't subdivide to less than 160 acres. We have
wow. I didn't know that.
Oh, it's awesome. I mean, there's kind of little, around town, there's like a mile or there's a couple of subdivisions that have been here since before that rule. But for the most part, that rule is in effect. And so keeping that rule in effect, it's like that could change and that would be awful, honestly. So keeping that rule in effect, most of our ranch is under conservation easement. And so, but not all of our neighbors are. I mean, we just had neighboring land that was sold and is getting subdivided into 160s. And so looking at where those places are vulnerable, definitely, and trying to keep this landscape wild, and not just for us, not just because we like to look at wide open spaces. I mean, everyone does, right? It's not just us, it's everyone driving through here, but it's also because we are such an important place ecologically in the Blackfoot. I mean, it's the main corridor for people going from Yellowstone to Glacier, but it's also the main, connection in that corridor for wildlife too. And being at the, base of the Bob Marshall Wilderness and Scapegoat Wildernesses. And, one of the cool things about the Blackfoot is that every species that Lewis and Clark listed on their journey through here is still here.
Oh, wow. And, that's cool.
Yeah. So, we got to be a home for the bears and the wolves, whatever challenges that comes with. But so I think definitely development. A huge unknown is like social ideas about ranching in general, with the rise of fake meat and the perception of ranching. I think that really has to turn around because I think as people become more conservation minded and climate change minded, everyone's trying to do the right thing. And unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation out there about what agriculture is and what ranching is and the impact that cows have on the environment. And so I think making sure that people realize that if we don't consume meat anymore as a society, we are going to lose one of the best management tools we have for rangelands in the West. And so I think that's something we think about a lot, is how to educate people on the importance of grazing and then how to just make those relationships with our customers or just people in general so that, we're just all educating each other on what we're doing and how we're stewarding, this landscape. So I think those are two of the big ones. I mean, there's plenty of things, variability in markets is hard, it's like climate change is hard. There's a lot of challenges down the road for ranches. That's for sure.
When you talk about educating, people need to be educated on grasslands and ranching and the importance of having grasslands for climate change and that kind of thing. Are there any, who do you think, who comes to mind first, or books or any sort of resources or organizations that are working on that, where people, like, say somebody's listening to this, they don't know anything about it. Where would you direct them to go to learn more about that?
Yeah, I would say, the Quivira Coalition is a great, resource. There's a website called Soil Carbon Cowboys that I really like. They've got different clips from different ranches across the whole U.S., kind of sharing how they're building soil carbon. There's a lot of books. I'm trying to think of the one that's the most reader friendly, like the Defending Beef, I think is a good one. So I was formerly a vegan many years ago.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. Yeah. And so food has always been very important to me. And I've gone a lot of different directions with that and dug into that a lot. And I like Defending Beef because it's a vegetarian writing a book about the importance of beef, a vegetarian who marries a cattle rancher. So it's relatable to me as a former vegan, now turned cattle rancher. So I think there's a lot of great resources that, there's like for the, a lot of great documentaries on Netflix even. And, just talking to people too, talking to, local farmers and ranchers, just sitting down at a farmer's market and chatting with someone, it's just like educating yourself on the how, because when you talk about bashing meat, it's like, it's all about the how, it's like if you're cutting down the Amazon rainforest which is, a huge carbon sink to do a certain type of grazing. Like, I'm not going to pretend like that's the best thing for our planet. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
But in a Western native range, there's nothing better for that landscape than to be grazed in a very specific and mindful way.
Yep.
Trying to work along with nature. And I think just people don't understand that, like, all of these, I would say I'm a disturbance ecologist. I, kind of started in forestry in that realm with looking at the, fire and forest. And now I feel like that mindset has really shifted to rangelands and thinking about what disturbance did rangelands evolve with. And it's like they evolved with ungulates, like they evolved with grazers. And so if you remove grazers from a landscape, it's, one of the worst things you can do for it.
Yep.
And so, and people don't know that. And so it's like, that to me is like the one thing that if I could tell anybody, it would just be that grazers and grasslands are intermingled, they're so dependent on each other. So
the best book I've read on it, and I say this kind of ad nauseum, I don't think I've said it in a while, but so if there are any new listeners, but all the old listeners will have to hear me say it again. But Jim Howell's book, For the Love of Land, that was the book that I read when I finally got it. And I'd been like kind of tangentially involved in ranching through the real estate business, which I don't know, I kind of regret that, but but when I read that book, it all became very clear, and I just had not put it all together that, these grasses and grazing, ungulates, is that how you say it? They evolve together, and the grasses have to be grazed. And if they're not grazed, they're going to die. And Jim just lays it out in a series of different, short chapters. And so if anybody's interested in digging into that, I would highly recommend that book. And I've had Jim on the podcast twice. I think he was like the fourth person I ever had on the podcast. And so and then I've had his wife, Daniela, who's the CEO of the Savory Institute, and she speaks about it. So there's a lot of, I've had a lot of folks on the podcast who can speak to that pretty well, but it's unbelievably interesting. And even for somebody like me, who very curious, very open-minded, I didn't get it. It took me a long time to get it. And so I can have some compassion for folks who don't fully understand it yet, but it takes effort to understand this stuff. So you mentioned Quivira. Let's talk about how you ended up on the Mannix Ranch, because I bet when you showed up, you didn't think you were going to be there for as long as you're going to be there. So
I know.
How'd you end up there?
I know. I had all these dreams. I was like going to be the, cowboy with the saddle thrown in the back of a pickup truck, driving around all these different operations. And like the third place I ended up, now I'm here forever. So life never goes the way you think. So I came to Montana. So I'm originally from California. I'm one of those, but I came to Montana for just right after college. I went to grad school at the University of Montana in forestry. And then I worked for a couple years working across the state, doing forest management as a private consultant. So I worked, on some public lands, but I worked with a lot of private landowners and a fair number of ranches. And after a couple of years of doing that, I became a desk jockey, and that's not ever really been, I'm not well suited to that position.
Yeah.
And so I needed a change, and I had just this inkling. And I think this is important because I didn't grow up on a ranch. I grew up in an agriculture and a timber community in the far northern reaches of Northern California. But my only exposure to ranching up to this point had been, working at, I went to a week of horse summer camp each year growing up. And then I worked there for a summer in high school as a wrangler. And then I did a week long local agriculture alternative spring break in college. And we were on a cattle ranch for like a day. So I really didn't have a background in ranching, but I had even those little experiences sort of were always in the back of my mind. And so when I found myself sort of lost, as we all do, I think, in our mid-20s,
yep.
I just had this little inkling, and it took me like a year to kind of get up the courage to make that change, because I'd been working towards this one direction for a long time. And then also to figure out the how. There's not that many opportunities for folks that are not raised in ranching to sort of jump in.
Yep.
And so through that, I eventually found Quivira. And at the time, they didn't have anything in Montana. And so I took a position down in New Mexico. And so I worked for a couple of folks who had a lease on the Mescalero Apache reservation in New Mexico in the Sacramento Mountains.
Yep.
And I went down there, and it was, like within a week, I was like, okay, this is it. I was like, maybe I want to be a rancher. Maybe I'll just do this for a year and then move back to my career. But it was like a week into it, and I was like, this is my life. This is what I do now.
Like, what about it? Like, what specifically that quick? I mean, obviously there's the being outside, and it's kind of an adventure, but it's extremely hard work, especially if you're coming off of a desk job. So like, what can you pin down what it was that locked you in so quick?
I think for me, I've always been someone who wants to work both mind and body.
Yeah.
And, it's like, I've done physical labor before that was mindless. I was like a sawyer for some time. I was just cutting down trees or thinning forests. And that's something that's like, yes, it takes a lot of mental awareness to figure out how to cut down a tree. Right. But something that was so diverse in what you're tackling all the time. So it kind of fit on that level. It fit on the physical label of being able to sort of, be active. And then also just on the moral level too, of really believing in what I was doing and learning about that relationship. For me, it's always been that relationship between humans and nature, and like, how do you mimic nature to the best, advantage for that landscape. With forestry, I was always fascinated by that relationship between, how can we thin our forests or thin and burn our forests to mimic the, historical fire regimes in the West? How can we use our cattle to mimic the grazing and better, because buffalo are not like perfect grazers, yep. They messed a lot of stuff up before we were here too. But how can you, better manage your landscapes through a product that then feeds the world? That's such an intoxicating, cool thing. So I think just that ideological alignment with then the physical and the mental alignment too, of like problem solving every day. Yeah. And then I was on horseback for a year. How cool is that?
That's a really good answer, by the way. Like it seems like, I hope I'm not like the 100th person to ask you that, because like that answer was like perfect. You should write that. We'll transcribe that. That can be the opening chapter of your book one day, because it was really good. As I have like the whole rest of my day lined up with more with Zoom meetings, that makes me like reconsider my career choices. Just joking.
Well, it's funny because hindsight is always 2020.
Yeah. You're right. You're right.
Why did it take me to 25?
That's pretty early. I was 40 when I figured it out.
That's the thing, and you're like, well, how did I not get here earlier? It's like, and it's funny though, because like, one of the things that I do think is funny is that first week I'm like, all right, this is it. But then I have this journal entry and I'm like, the cattle at that point, like the actual cow part of it wasn't that exciting to me. And so I always say like, I came for the range management, but I ended up staying in ranching because of the cattle and the relationship to animals. I think like the stockmanship component really crept up on me, but that's what I love. I love working with the animals, getting, and working with all animals. I have a working dog. So like working with my dog, working with the horse that I'm riding, working with the cattle, and like understanding, I've done, some stockmanship workshops and understanding just how to talk cow, sort of with your body. And like that whole part really surprised me, how much I got addicted to that. So it's, and I didn't have that in my life until I was, again, 25. So it's so interesting on how these things creep up on you and you're like, oh, wow, I can't live without that. But, I apparently did for a long time.
There are these really weird experiences like that when it's like something kind of locks into something that's in your DNA. And I'm not a big time bird hunter at all, but whenever I do go and you're out there with those dogs and they're running around, they're working with you. And I've never been involved with working dogs, like working cattle or anything, but I would imagine it's the same thing where it's just this connection with the animals. And it almost feels like right, like it's supposed to be that way. And I think, when you read about the history of humans and dogs and that kind of thing, and it's really cool to have that connection with those animals. So that's neat to hear you say that. So you're in New Mexico. How did you end up in Montana? When did that happen?
Yeah. So from there, it's just like a series of phone calls, basically. But no, I had, I was driving back from New Mexico with really no plan in mind except for to go back to Montana. The heat kind of did me in after a year down there. And I got connected through my boss in New Mexico. So everyone I worked with in New Mexico, they're former ranch lands employees. Yep. And so, that community is huge and such a great resource. And so I sort of like slipped in to that community, and they had worked with Cooper Hibbard, who owns or is the manager at Sebin Livestock out of Cascade. And so from there, I got connected with Cooper, and Cooper said, yeah, come on for, a couple months, come on for the winter and help us with winter work. And it had always been a dream of mine to work for Sebin Livestock. It's a really cool operation. I had done some forestry work for them, actually. So it was just like a phone call, and I got to go up to Cascade. And so I worked up at Cascade for a couple months over the winter. And during that time, the Quivira Coalition had expanded into Montana, and they had hired Alexis Boganovsky, who's been on this podcast.
She is so awesome. She's one of my heroes in life.
Yeah, me too. She's the coolest. So they had hired her, and she's done so much for this program, for the Quivira program in Montana, and they were just getting started. I think there was like 4 or 5 Montana ranches that first year, and now there's like 20. But so one of the ranches they had signed on was the Mannix Ranch. Yep. And what really appealed to me about the Mannix Brothers Ranch was, for one thing, it was right between Missoula and Helena. And those were the 2 places in Montana I had lived up to that point. So it was like, after going to New Mexico, where I didn't know a single person and lived, an hour down a dirt road, it was kind of like this coming home moment where I wanted to be a little closer to folks. But I also felt like it'd be a really good sort of pairing with what I had been doing. Because in New Mexico, I was on a horse basically every day for 8 months. And in that ground, we didn't do any irrigating. We didn't do any haying. So I still had a lot of pretty big gaps in my ranching education. And so the Mannix Ranch is really diverse and does so many different things that I felt like it would be a really good sort of way to finish out that early ranching education. So yep. I applied and got hired on. And again, primarily because I think I'd worked for Cooper, and Cooper is someone that the Mannixes really respect. So I kind of got this great train of like, once you're in the community, you really benefit from all these relationships you make, because it's such, regenerative agriculture is really a small community in a well-connected community in the West. And so it's just a great sort of, I fell in with the right people, and I'm really grateful for that. But then I ended up here, and it's just the perfect fit. I mean, the community here is incredible. The family is amazing. And then of course I met my husband. And so now I live here forever.
What do your folks think about the path that you've taken?
I think they're into it. My dad is a marine engineer, and my mom's done a number of things over life, but none of them included ranching. She was never a really big fan of horses, but I think when I wanted to be a farmer in college, which was a phase, they are a little bit skeptical. And I think they were relieved when I sort of chose the more outlined forestry route. But I think, by the time they get here, and they really love the Mannixes. So I think that idea of like falling in with such great people is all they care about. But yeah, it is pretty funny. And my dad, God bless him, comes out and gets a little bit of cow poop on him. And goes goes running, but I think, I mean, every young man has a dream of being a cowboy. So I think he gets to fulfill a little bit of that when he comes to visit too.
That is really cool. One thing that I forgot to follow up on a few minutes ago. What made you decide to stop being a vegan? I've tried vegan. I tried vegan for a month one time, and my takeaway was that it was a pain in the ass for me. Like, I mean, yeah. I wasn't training hard. Like now I'm running so much, everything. Like I don't know how my body would handle it, but I felt fine. But it was just like, golly, this is unbelievable pain. And that's not a judgment on anybody who's a vegan. That's just my weird take on it. What was your take on it?
Right. So then college, and I became, part of the thing I did in college was help start a student-owned and operated food co-op.
Oh, cool.
And so I became really sort of invested in like food and where I was sourcing my food and what was the, best thing for, health and environment and everything. And I think, many of us go through that journey. And for me, veganism is a little bit of a low hanging fruit when it comes to like what, you think you should be doing, I think, because there's so much hype around it.
Yeah.
And I would say that it did not do my body any favors. I was like sick all the time. I broke out, with like, I think I had like a face rash that showed up at one time. I mean, it was just bad. And so after 3 months of doing that, I switched to a paleo diet.
Oh, did you really? And what was the difference?
180. Oh, it was so much better. But I think one of the things is, so I did like that day or that week long spring break where we were working on like a chicken farm one day, and then a beef and vegetable farm one day. So we did this kind of alternate spring break. And then the last day we went to a tofu factory. Uh-huh. And that contrast of being like on the landscape and seeing how all of these things got integrated and like, seeing how the vegetables and the cows and the chickens, how they all work together, and then going to like this really sterile, processing plant.
Yeah.
And like seeing this thing getting created. And I think that really kind of knocked me out of that sort of idea that maybe I shouldn't be eating meat. And then the other one was, we took a wildlife class and we were watching a David Attenborough video about, I think it was like lions attacking a zebra.
Yeah.
And they were like, or maybe it was crocodiles. It was like crocodiles drowning a zebra at a watering hole in Africa. And I was like, I don't know why I think that like killing animals is cruel, because the way that we do it is so much more humane than the way that nature does it. And so that sort of maybe shook me out of the other, side of that, the ethical side of just like, let's focus more on how we raise our animals and what impact they have, and kind of find some peace with the fact that, there's a circle of life, and life and death come hand in hand. And we sort of just have to find the best way to do both of them.
Yeah. I think from a nutrition standpoint, I think everybody is completely different. And I really do think some people thrive on a vegan diet. Like, I follow these ultra runner types, and there are a few of these champion ultra runners, the best in the history of the sport who are vegans. And obviously that works well with their body type. But I think there's a lot of people who it doesn't work well. And the only way to know is to experiment with it. But like I had Kate Kavanaugh on here, she was a vegan for a long time. And now she she's still the owner of a butcher shop in Denver. And she experienced a lot of mental health issues. And then when she started eating meat, it cleared it up. And I'm not saying I think nowadays everybody wants to just apply one like blanket statements to every single human on earth. And I'm a believer that every single person is completely different. And so, for me, I have to have meat. I follow the Laird Hamilton diet, that surfer. He says, I eat plants and animals, and that's it. Although sometimes I go crazy with like potato chips and stuff, but overall plants and animals, and that works for me. And if it doesn't work for you or whoever's listening, no, I don't take any offense. I don't get mad about it, but
yeah,
totally. What I mean?
Yeah. And it honestly, for me, my thing is the how. How was that vegetable raised? How was that cow raised? I mean, like, we just heard this from at a soil health conference. There's more diversity of life in a single cow patty than there is in a soybean field.
Oh, wow.
And you think about that, and it just, so it's like, if you're just eating, a bunch of monocultured crops, that's not better for the planet than eating, a meat that's been raised a certain way. So it's like the how of everything, and even like the nutritional value of things, like we've exported so many nutrients from our farmlands. And so even the vegetables that we're growing, they don't have the nutrients that they're supposed to have, because the soil is devoid of those nutrients. So it's like, I think a lot about, it's not whether you're vegan or vegetarian or whatever. It's just, how is the food that you're eating impacting the planet and your body? And a lot of times they're, similar impacts. If your soil is devoid of nutrients, your body's going to be devoid of nutrients. So
you hunt, correct? Yeah. Do you hunt deer? And
yeah.
Tell me about that. When did that come into your life? Because I just had my first elk hunt in January, and I knew it would be cool. I mean, I wouldn't have gone otherwise if I didn't think it would be like a fun, kind of interesting, but it was, even now that I'm like 3 months out from it, it was like a life-changing event for me. Both, the killing combined with the processing the meat. That I went with a guy named Adam Gall, and his whole part of his guiding company is that you kill the elk, and then you go through the entire butchering and processing, which, takes like 6 hours to process a full elk, and life-changing for me. So and I'm 44. So, I mean, again, like having these crazy life-changing experiences when you're supposed to be kind of stuck in your ways maybe, but when did hunting enter your life?
You're doing it right.
I hope so.
Yeah. That was a Montana thing. So it happened during my desk jockey era. And I would say part of it was, that restlessness about, getting out and interacting with nature. I know you talk about Sufferfest a lot on this podcast, and I love a good Sufferfest, but one that's got a point, like I want to have a purpose for my Sufferfest.
Well, that's where you and I are different, because I pay money to people so I can go run around in circles in the woods for 36 hours straight. Yeah. Maybe there's a purpose in there somewhere, but it's not as clear as like getting food on the table. So you're smarter than me.
Oh, it's funny. I realize I drive around now when we're driving across the state, and I'll look at, some cool country. I'm like, I would love to gather some cows off of that. It's like, it's like, not just go for a walk, you got it. But so I think that's kind of where it came from. And then I had a lot of hunters in my community. And so, yeah, I kind of I really tried to do it alone. And I'm really glad that when I shot my first deer, I wasn't alone, because I had been hunting for quite a while, and I'd, gone to like a Fish, Wildlife and Parks butchering demonstration and done some YouTube and, read Meat Eater, but it was really good that I had someone there with me, to help me with that first process, because it wasn't as clean, as I had hoped it would be. And then, so I've mostly hunted with a rifle. And then, when I got out here, Bryan, my husband, is a really big archery hunter. And so I went with him, started going with him, and got to do the archery hunting thing, which is, talk about life-changing. You can watch as many hunting movies as you want until you have a bugling elk coming right at you.
I can't imagine it. It's
wild. And I was sitting there in this, the first time it happened, I'm like sitting there in this, trees, and I'm looking at this elk, and I'm holding my bow, and I'm like, there is no way I am getting this bow up and, pulled and drawn and shooting that. The second he's coming towards me, I just gave up all notion that I was going to be able to function,
Yeah.
and it's just, it's a wild experience to be, in that. I totally get the addiction. But not now. So, usually Bryan will bring home an elk, but, I go out in the fall and shoot what I can. I haven't actually gotten an elk yet, so that's on my hopeful list, but usually end up bringing home a white-tailed buck or something. And it's just awesome. It's such a great way to interact with nature.
Well, yeah, I think it locks into some part, like I was kind of blabbing about earlier, about locking into some part of our DNA. I think it obviously does that, but then just really understanding and appreciating what is involved with getting meat from outside onto your table. And whether that's even, going to the grocery store, I think about that differently now, because you know what had to happen for the animal to grow up. And then even if it went through the most industrial process you could imagine, it's still quite a miracle that meat ends up on your, in your refrigerator. So I don't know that I'll ever be like completely obsessed with hunting, but I want to do it, at least every other year. Cause if for no other reason than just having all that great food, it's an amazing thing. I think the way you and I initially connected, which would have been years ago, was you sent me a nice email and pointing me in the direction of the people at Red Ants Pants, because you had done a program with them. And at that point, for some reason, I'm kind of out of it half the time. I wasn't aware of what they were doing, but then I had Sarah Calhoun come on the podcast, and she's just so awesome. And I've just become such a fan of not only Red Ants Pants and their business, but just the way they use business to develop communities. And how did that, can you talk about that experience with them?
Yeah. No, you're so right on. I mean, talk about heroes. Sarah's another one of mine. So I was initially involved. I reached out to them because they have part of their foundation is running a kind of women's rural skills. And Sarah got her start on trail crew. And so timber skills are sort of, the first on her list. And so there's a carpentry course and a chainsaw course held up there in White Sulphur Springs each year. And so I just kind of asked if I could come along and help out. And it's a great experience. I've done it a couple times now. And I kind of act as an assistant teacher of some sort. She's got some really great instructors, female instructors that are real badasses with a chainsaw.
Yeah.
And so I've been able to be involved in that, and it's just great. And then this year, I was super honored to be selected as one of the mentors for girls leadership program. And that's been such a treat. It's been so cool. And I'm just really impressed with the whole program. And then honestly, I don't interact with teenage girls all that much. And I cannot believe how intelligent and insightful they are. They're really, they're just amazing young women. And, in a world full of plenty of despairing things, it's really hopeful to be working with them.
What would you say is more important or more impactful in the long run from that program? Is it knowing how to use a chainsaw, or are there kind of lessons in confidence and just basically knowing that you're a badass for being able to do that kind of stuff? I mean, is it maybe a combo of the two? Because I would just think there'd be so much, I don't know. I would just think it'd be a real ego boost in the best way, learning how to do something like that.
Yeah, it's so great. I mean, the women, they come and they're nervous. And so there's definitely a lot of them have maybe some timbered property. I mean, they come from all over the country. So, they got Minnesota timber or Pennsylvania timber too, but the rewarding part as someone who's involved is definitely just that confidence boost. And I mean, for me, I think a lot of times I felt like this about ranching at one point, it's like, oh, I can't do that. I don't have all of these things that require that. And it's such a mental block. I mean, those mental blocks that you put on yourselves, those boundaries that you put on yourselves that just don't exist in reality. So seeing these women come and really have no feeling that this is something that they could do, and then just watching them sort of gain confidence over the weekend is so cool. And I think, like you're saying, I mean, that confidence to try new things and then the success of that, I think feeds into every aspect of your life. Then you look at things not as barriers, but as opportunities. So I think that's a huge part of it.
One question, and if you don't want to talk about this, absolutely no worries. I'll cut it out, and I'll cut out me right now saying that we'll cut it out. Do you want to talk about your health scare at all or not?
Yeah, no, I can talk about it.
Well, I'd love to hear about it because I had a not even close to as serious as your health scare, but I had a health scare when I was 30 that I really credit with kind of changing the trajectory of my career and life and all that kind of stuff. What happened? Like, what can you just talk about kind of what happened and how that affected you?
Yeah. It's definitely been a big one for me. So I was, in 2020, the year where all good things happen. I was diagnosed with a very rare form of ovarian cancer. And the way that I was diagnosed was pretty jarring, I guess. I mean, I don't think anybody is ready for a cancer diagnosis, but it was a pretty quick turnaround. I had sort of an extended abdomen. And so what's really funny is my doctor now, every time I call her about one thing, she's like, we got to get you in because it's always something else. It's I got in to get my allergy steroid that I get for haying season.
Yeah.
And for irrigating season. And I was like, oh, and by the way, my abdomen feels a little funny. And she, checked that out and she was like, we're getting you a CT scan tomorrow. And so I got my CT scan the next morning, and by the next afternoon, I knew that I had a melon-sized mass in my abdomen. And so then a week, I don't know, sometime within the next week, I was on the phone with a set of ovarian specialists, ovarian oncologists, or gynecological oncologists. They do all sorts of things over in Billings. And then I think, it was like the next Friday that I went in for surgery. And so then they removed the mass, and when they tested it, they found cancer. Mm-hmm. And then there was a 3-week period where we didn't know how severe it was. And I think those 3 weeks are probably the most impactful 3 weeks because, when you have an unknown like that, is this it? Is this how I go? I had every story of stage 4 cancer comes to mind. Mm-hmm. Every, just horror of being dead in a couple of weeks comes to mind. And so that 3 weeks, I think, really shaped how I approach things because I had that initial reaction, as anyone would, of fear, of just really deep-seated fear and terror, and kind of went to the worst case scenario. And I lived there for a couple of days, and I was exhausted by the end of that. It was like, and at some point I was like, I cannot exist like this. I cannot keep this up. And so I just decided that I wasn't going to die. And I decided that it was going to be okay. And I decided that I would just tackle everything as it came. And I stuck with that decision, that stuck mentally. And having that control over my thoughts and how I viewed something was extremely empowering. And so, 3 weeks later, we found out my diagnosis, and it was pretty good. And so then I went into chemotherapy to sort of clean out and anything that was remaining.
Yep.
And talk about a sufferfest. Chemo, I do not recommend. It is not fun by any means.
And how long was that process?
I was in chemo for 3 months, but I was under a very intense regime. So I went into chemo for 5 days in a row, and I would get poison dripped into my veins for 4 or 5 hours. And then I would get a couple weeks off, and I would go back and do it again. And that mental, the mental fortitude it required to get up and go to the hospital by Friday was like more than I'd ever required before.
Yeah, understandable. I mean,
there's like
I can't imagine.
Yeah. Yeah. Your body knows, like, your body's like, don't go do that again. That was horrible.
Yeah.
So yeah. And it was funny. We were, I didn't really think about that, kind of exercising that mental strength until later that fall. We went on a trip down the Grand Canyon, which was awesome, with my sister, but we had to hike out halfway through because we could only take a couple weeks to do it. And so we were hiking out, and we'd been on the river, like sitting on boats for 10 days. And we didn't get started to the hike out of Phantom Ranch until 2:00 in the afternoon because we were waiting for bags or something. I don't know if you've done that hike.
No, I've never done it. I've floated past Phantom Ranch, but I've never hiked in and out. I want to though.
It's a slog.
Yeah, that's what I've heard.
I mean, it's like, it's a slog. And so we're like on this journey in the dark, in the rain, out of this, and everyone in our crew is kind of like responding in the ways that they do. And I just kept thinking that whole slog, because we were carrying like 60, 70 pounds on our back, because my sister said, oh, we're on a raft, bring everything. And so it was just a slog. And I was like, well, it's not chemo, so it's like, I think everything that I do now that seems hard, it's like, well, it's better than chemo.
Yeah. No, that's, well, first of all, I'm glad you're okay. I can't even imagine what that whole thing was like. And so like, when you look back on who you were 2 weeks before you got that diagnosis and who you are now, how would you say you're different?
Yeah, I would say the biggest thing, and I went through that summer and I felt mentally strong. I felt like, it was really hard, but I felt like I was getting through it. And then what I didn't expect was the PTSD that comes from that, and there's a great book by Salika Jawad. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. It's called Between Two Kingdoms. And she was diagnosed with leukemia when she was in her early 20s, like right out of college.
Okay.
And was fighting through that for, it's like 5 years, I think. And she captures the essence of being a cancer patient, of the trauma that comes from not trusting your own body and not trusting your future, in a way that I think is just really potent. But that kind of learning how to trust my own body again was huge. And then also, I would say before, I was in a category that I think most of us are a lot, and you probably were too before you got your diagnosis too, of just like, you think, you've heard the slogan enough, like live every moment like it's your fullest, or, like life's too short, or, we could all die tomorrow. Like you hear these slogans all the time, but I think to really live that and like live by that is a real gift. Like I feel so much more at peace with death. I feel so much less fear. I feel so much more drive to just, do everything that I want to do, that I feel like I'm called to do, because who knows, I came out of that experience aware of my genetic mutation that leaves me susceptible to a lot of different cancers, and they're all young adult cancers, which is great. You're like, by the time I'm done worrying about these cancers, I'm going to start worrying about the normal cancers that we all get, from our environment. So, just that awareness that don't let it loom, don't let it loom over you, but be aware that like death is a part of life, and being at peace with that is something that is a huge gift that came out of that. And then just, reprioritizing, like one of the things that I've done since that experience was I finally like started my fiber natural dyeing business. And like, that's something that I had in the back of my mind for a long time. And as soon as I was, healed enough to start it, I went for it. And that's been so rewarding. And so it's like the things that you think you want to do someday, it's like, well, you better start doing them now, because who knows?
Yeah. No, it's kind of like they're cliches, and they're cliches for a reason. And, I think everybody knows that, the things you were saying, like, you got to live like each day's your last, and, not being acting like crazy or anything, but all this kind of stuff. But I would imagine that it's not until you're deep in it that you really understand it. I mean, I think there probably are ways. Some people are lucky enough if they read enough books or whatever, and they can but that's a real quick way to get your priorities real straight, real quick. And again, like, my thing wasn't even close to anything like you had, but it wasn't nothing was an instant change for me, but it was definitely a shift in just putting up with a bunch of bullshit, like, I'm not, the bullshit filter got a lot more intense. And
yeah, no, it totally does. And, like, and just what do you worry about? What are the things you worry about? And, like, do you need to be worrying about that? It's like, you really just let life go, just let it go, and, jump on the ride, and, do what you feel like you are called to do. And, and then you'll die. Someday we'll die.
No, it's the truth. Circle of life.
Yeah. It's like, we're all one day closer to death. So
I think in some ways that's freeing. I read all this Buddhist philosophy, and I'm not a Buddhist, but I really connect with a lot of the teachings and the things you can learn from it. And one of the things they constantly talk about is you got to get comfortable with groundlessness, and you got to know that everything is, we're just living in this chaotic environment, and nothing is really in our control. And the sooner you can accept that is freeing. Once you can accept that, it's actually freeing. And it seems like that's counterintuitive. Or when I first read that, I was like, that doesn't make any sense, but it makes perfect sense to me now. And it's the best way to kind of free yourself of all this, the kind of neurotic, crazy stuff that I used to do. Not that I've got it all figured out now, but I don't know. I highly encourage people to, I don't know if you ever read any Pema Chodron, but I feel like she is the wisest human being on earth. And she talks about all that kind of stuff.
No, she's amazing. One of the things, that you bring up Buddhism is, like, one of the things that I came out of cancer with too was the shared experience of suffering. And, like, so when I was in treatment, we're in COVID, the Black Lives Matter protests were going on, and there's a lot of suffering in that community. There's a lot of suffering, just pain in the world, and opening myself up to that pain, and feeling that shared human experience of suffering was really powerful for me, and really left me in such a better headspace going through what I was going through. And, because when you open yourself up to suffering, and when you open yourself up to the pain of others, what comes out of that is empathy, and it's hard, but it's beautiful, and so it's like, and I wish that we would do that more as a civilization. I wish that we would open ourselves up, because we can all say that we empathize or acknowledge, but I just don't think that we really open ourselves up to the experience of other people, and, like, the pain and the suffering that they and their communities are enduring enough. And so I don't know. I think that's a Buddhist thing that I really came away with.
Oh, I completely agree. I completely agree with that. And I think that you can apply that on so many levels. There's some book that I reference on here a lot that is called Lincoln's Melancholy. And it's about Abraham Lincoln and how he was just severely depressed for a vast majority of his life, even suicidal at points. And they said that, the reason he was the perfect leader for that perfect time in history, it was not in spite of his mental health challenges. It was because of his mental health challenges, because he understood how to be empathetic with people. He understood suffering, and he understood the need to, I don't know, just to be kind, I guess. And I thought that was, I think a lot of times when somebody has a challenge, whether it's physical health, mental health, whatever, people say, well, they did such and such, even though they had this disability or but they had this challenge. When I think more times than not, it's because they had the challenge is what makes things work out for them. So totally. I'm very sorry you had to go through that, but now that you're all healed up and ready to go, like, I think it's, you're even better than you were before because of it. So it's definitely pretty awesome, man. I wasn't really timing this one since we had to go with plan B for recording, but I think we're like well over an hour now and I'm late for a meeting. But I'm going to be late for the meeting because I want to keep talking about this. Tell me some books, either books that you have recently read that have meant a lot to you, or just some of your favorite books. And they could be about the West, or they could just be about anything.
Yeah. So I wrote down a couple, and so I have a wide ranging interest in things, all sorts of things. So these will be kind of all over the place. But so one I want to plug because it's a local author, and I'll give a short backstory by this. So when I was living in Helena, I needed my ash tree trimmed up. Mm-hmm. And so I called our local arborist, and his name is Tom Harple. And he came and he was just a hoot. He was telling all these great stories. He let me climb into the tree, which was awesome. And then fast forward, now I'm living here in the Blackfoot. Turns out he ranched just down the road from us for a long time. And it also turns out that, so my parents have moved to Helena, and turns out he lives 3 houses down from them.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So he's just been kind of in and out of life over the past couple of years, but it turns out he's an author. And I just got to reading his book must have been a couple months ago, and it is awesome. So it's called Regarding Willingness, and okay. It's by Tom Harple. And I don't know if you like Mark Twain's writing, but I love Mark Twain, like his Life on the Mississippi and Roughing It. I love both of those books. And Tom writes kind of like him, and he tells these awesome stories. It's just short stories, and there might be about something that happened in Montana, or he went over like right after, it's during when the Soviet Union was there, and he skydived with the Soviet Union skydivers and like literally learned how to skydive in Russian, and then just assumed that he would figure it out as he went. And so he's basically this total adrenaline junkie, and he's done all these crazy things. He him and this other truck were the only guys, or him in this truck, they were the only truck crossing the Trans-Alaskan Highway during this negative 60-degree storm. Damn, I need to get this guy on the podcast. I know. Yeah. He is fascinating. You should get him on the podcast. But yeah, he's got one arm because he cut it off as an arborist. He was like a horse logger in Oregon for a long time. So anyways, Regarding Willingness is a great book. And then I have been really into Nigerian American authors lately. Mm-hmm. And so I really liked Americana by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And then I've been reading an author named Nnedi Okorafor, and she writes really beautiful books that are fiction, but they're based in Africa, like post-apocalyptic Africa, or kind of got a fantasy side to her, but just really well written books. And the kind of getting to know the Nigerian American legends is pretty cool.
Those are all new to me. Every single one of those is new to me. So that's why I ask. That's awesome. I'll have links to those for people listening. That's super cool. Anything else? You might need to come back on because we got more stuff we need to talk about. We'll do a part 2. I want to do it in person. I want to come see your family's place.
You should.
And, not that I'm trying to invite myself into your
You should.
house.
No, well, you're invited.
All right. Thank you. Well, let's make that happen. But this was awesome. I'm really, really glad we got this to work out. And thank you for taking the time. Thanks for being so open and thoughtful with everything we discussed. And I'll look forward to hanging out in person one of these days.
Sounds great. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number 1, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number 2, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number 3, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number 4, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.